Adding some sparkling vibes to the DOIs today, our acclaimed speaker is a senior principal, software architect, and DevSecOps advisor with MITRE Corp. She is just as passionate about mentoring and training as she is about architecting sustainable solution ecosystems. She enjoys community and knowledge building with her teams, her clients, and the next generation of technologists by guest lecturing at universities, leading working groups, and sharing her experience stories. She is joining us today on the DOIS stage to share her deep insights on DataOps, the emerging principles of DataOps in the industry, and the opportunity around it. With that, conquering your screens right now, let's welcome our thought leader, Ms. Tracy Bannon.
Hi there, my name is Tracy Bannon, and I'm a senior principal with the MITRE Corporation. We're a federally funded research and development corporation. We're chartered by the US Congress, and I spend my days as an architect, as an engineer, and as a DevOps advisor. Today, I want to talk to you about what I see as the missing link for DevOps. That's data. So are we there yet? Well, we've all been talking about the challenges of adopting DevOps, and we're wading through approaches and learning from one another. We're moving towards a more common definition, a lexicon on what DevOps is. We're working together to figure out how we reduce that resistance to change. We're moving towards dev and ops together, cutting down the differences in the silos, and we're tempering that hyper focus on tools. That's all good movement. Even so, the research shows quality's not improving. I first heard Joe Wessel use this phrase, and it really resonated with me. Quality is going down the drain with the pipeline. So I'm going to pose that as the question. Is quality going down the drain with the pipeline? If we're automating testing, how can quality go down? We're all unit testing, right? We're all focused on code coverage, the magic metric, code coverage, right? In addition, we're adding in some Selenium testing for good measure. Well, we're all familiar with the infinity loop for DevOps by now. Can you spot the problem here? Look at this. Notice that test appears to be an isolated step. Granted, it's part of a continuous loop. So shifting it to the left or shift right, as in production testing, is not the answer. Quality and testing are part of every aspect of DevOps. So we need to rethink the wording of the infinity loop, and we need to rethink where the arrows are pointing to testing. So let's draw it like this. We need to be more specific during each and every phase, every step, every transition. Whatever you call those colored chevrons, we need to specifically call out how we amplify testing and quality. Continuously, right? This is the figure 8. So I have a love-hate with that word. It makes so much sense, right? Constantly, chronically evaluating and improving. I had the opportunity recently to meet with Janet Gregory. She's the co-author of Agile Testing and the co-founder of the Agile Testing Fellowship, and she shared a version of the affinity loop that I can really get behind. She also doesn't like the word continuous anymore. You'll see her quote here. Continuous testing has been used and abused because the term has been hijacked. It was intended to mean focusing on testing and quality across the entire effort. But instead, let's talk about being holistic. I love this graphic. We'll see where this goes in industry, but you'll see every step of the way, there's a test and a quality mentality. Whether you're discovering, whether you're deploying, you're releasing, you're learning, you're building, you're understanding. This image is from Janet Gregory directly. She gave me permission to share this. But I think that this was here to help us draw forward where testing needs to exist within the infinity loop everywhere. There are some gaps. So if we start to think about testing more, we start to think about improving quality, where are the other gaps we need to fill? Well, we know about the lack of cohesive test planning. We know about skills gaps. We know that software is still tightly coupled. There was a flawed belief that architectural design just emerges. We know that's not the case. It doesn't. But given all of these known knowns, and given the industry is starting to address them, we're still seeing some failing of the testing. Do you see some numbers here that should surprise you? 620 million developer hours per year being spent on debugging. Why is the debugging so difficult? Why are we not able to do the testing in advance? Why are we not able to find these items? It's because we can't replicate the defects. Sometimes I call those having phantom defects. Why is it so hard to reproduce? Well, here's a little bit of humor for us all. I just love this graphic. We've got decades of engineering science behind us. Whitebox testing. If you're not familiar with that term, whitebox means that you have access to the code base and you can construct tests based on the understanding of the actual innards of the code. So I'm going to share a story with you. I was an enterprise architect for a very, very large organization. I had a team of architects, infrastructure, application, security, all on my team, and we worked across many lines of businesses as a shared service capability. The testing group also lived within our same IT shared services group, within ITSS with us, and there was a heavy push for automated testing. Well, budget clipped the wings of the testing group and they fell back to muscle memory, manual testing that happened late cycle. And I began to hear reports of errors that couldn't be reproduced, phantom errors. And what we uncovered is that some of the applications had heavy state management and there had to be refactoring. However, we also found that the data being used by QA was stale, often stale. They didn't reset it after every testing cycle, and the quality of the test data was really suspect. So let's talk about it. Essentially, a lack of adequate test data is eating into the productivity gains that agility and DevSecOps investments have for us. We're still failing, we're going slower, and we're sometimes depending on the pipeline. We do need to know, we do know that we need to test, but we also need to change the narrative a bit. This is kind of a funny slide, but it's intentional. From where, how will we test? How will we test this? We need to change the narrative to what should the test accomplish? How will we test this is still a resonating question, but what data do we need? What data do we need? And that's where we're going to go with the next part of this conversation, folks. So what types of data do we need for testing? It's a pretty big question. If we were together in an auditorium, I would ask you to just yell out the different types. You see them on the screen here on this word cloud: performance, whitebox, security, unit. But beyond the types of test data, there are other considerations. Folks don't always think about things like, what's your domain? Do you have some unique constraints, unique controls? PII, PCI, PHI. If you work with the government, are there data classifications that you need to be concerned about? Is the entire team aware of the architecture and the requirement and the quality attributes? And not everybody knows the term quality attribute. These are cross-cutting capabilities, the ilities, portability, scalability. Some kind call them non-functionals. But those are the different things we need to be considering when we're brainstorming up front on the types of data that we're going to need. But who makes the data? Well, it's the developers. If you look at this, this slide, this chart, developers make a lot of the data. Now, they make best case data. They're not thinking about every edge case. They understand the insides of the code. So they're developing data based on that. QA, these poor folks, they're using a spreadsheet to create based on what they're inheriting from the developers. Sometimes they'll be have access to requirements early enough that they can begin to make a broader set of data, but ultimately they're not always given the time or the energy that they need to create that. They'll often use masked outputs that are coming from production, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Security testers, they're making data too. I usually say they're rolling their own data. They're manually testing. Security testers, aside from some of the automated audits, but security testers are manually testing. Generally, it's ad hoc today. State of testing, it's still ad hoc. They're making the data that they need. It's not holistic. So the developers, QA, testers, all different sets of data. Some of it may be inherited and passed back and forth. What about the DBA? Well, God love them. They are copying production. They are masking. They're attempting to anonymize. They're bringing it back and handing it to everybody to use. Unfortunately, I'm not an advocate of depending on production. Production data represents a really accurate image of the data that works well, right? Production is up, production is working. So there is a benefit to looking at the production data, but it misses all the new stuff. And it is happy path, but it only covers 70 to 75% of the scenarios. But probably the most important reason that Bannon frowns on the use of production data is that we're not protecting that data from other hacking efforts. Look at the bottom of the screen for the slide that I show. 65% of companies are copying production data. Only 35% of them are masking it. So now we're bringing production into non-production, and we're not protecting it the same way from the hackers. So where do we get the data? Where should we get our test data? Lots of options, guys. I jokingly say we can build it, we can borrow it, we can buy it. And there's truth to this. Let's take a blended approach. Building is just that. It is manually interacting with the front end, exploring using synthetic generation. We can also borrow it. We can bring it in from production, but let's also look at masking of production, profiling of production to create synthetic generation rules. And we can look at borrowing from prior systems and transforming it. We can also buy it. We can go external. We can even screen scrape. Yes, we can go out and find public data sets and understand if they're applicable. No matter what, we do need to make sure that we're exploring the breadth of the different types of test data that we're going to acquire. We're going to de-identify it. We need to validate the data, but we need to look at how we're going to manage that. So let's say we have a good basis. There are still some stumbling blocks that I want to talk to you about. Regardless as to the approach, acquiring and preserving of test data is probably the most common challenge. We're doing a number of different surveys in government and industry, and what we're seeing on the initial numbers is that this is one of the biggest areas of challenge. Even if I make a good set of test data, how do I manage it? How do I preserve it? How do I reuse it? That leads me to the second stumbling block. Loading and reloading the data into environments is a challenge. If we don't have a repeatable initial state, by the way, it isn't a valid test. So let's tie this all back to DevOps. Like many of the DevOps challenges, tech isn't the issue for test data in an organization that is practicing DevOps rigor. It may be that we don't have a test strategy. We're trying to manufacture all of the data ourselves, but we're not using data subsetting. Some groups are writing their own masking tools when they're attempting to use open source, they're using other libraries, but they're not thinking about how they protect the copies of that data that are in other environments. It's really time consuming. And there are a lot of budgetary constraints for this. And we see that this is often the place where people start to pull back. If it costs a lot, well, let's fall back onto those manual testing. Something we often don't talk about as well is the data sprawl that comes with testing in DevOps. But it's important that we have strong test data management to drive us forward. So I want to share another personal experience with you. I was working as a software architect with a massive government agency, and it had the most complex test data requirements that I have ever experienced. Every public release of software had to have full production data, completely archived, aligned to policy and law for when that went forward. So if a citizen came forward with an objection, that they could go back to that exact time, that exact date, the rules that were in place, and they could play the data forward year after year to make it accurate. Well, you can imagine they had decades of test data aligned to decades of software versions, all of this policy in place, but there was no agreed on approach to how they were going to manage it. So they thought, we're just going to automate all the tests. We're going to come out this with test automation. We're going to automate the tests. Well, there was a heavy lift in managing the request for the data sets that went with this. And when they tried to automate all tests, they got easily overwhelmed. Well, we tried to put a central test management team in place for the test data, but it was understaffed. And they attempted to either use production data sets or make them from scratch. So after many setbacks from the approach, the delays and failures taught us the value of making risk decisions on what to automate and the value of profiling the data and using information that we profiled from the production data to feed the synthetic generation. The QA data management team also became very strong supporters of self-service provisioning. Managing test data requires quite a few different capabilities and considerations. Let's talk about what those are so you can carry those forward to your organizations. So in having test data management strategy, you need to be deliberate and very controlling of the data access, whether it's a developer's access, whether it's the access by the pipeline, needs to be deliberate and controlled. You need to maintain test data accuracy. Yes, you want to have data sets that remain endemic. You want to make sure that they are not being touched without there being improvements made to them. What I mean is test data becomes inaccurate over time as improvements are made. You want to make sure that you are securing the data in your non-production environment. You want to provide a way to store filtered criteria for data sets. Everybody doesn't get all of production every time. Think about the mass of data, especially in a highly integrated ecosystem. How can I then take that filtered criteria, understand what the data set is, tag it to a user story or a test case or a code branch? Data set versioning is important and data refresh on demand. And then also making sure that you have a mentality to delete all test data, not just the database, not just the data store, but logs and other files every time you're going to rerun the tests. Now, there are quite a number of test data management tools and platforms that can help you. I want to talk a little bit about how you can select and test data management set of tools to help you. Again, don't make that your goal. Make that an enabler of your organization and of your DevOps pipeline to improve testing, have a test data management strategy, and then focus on test data management platform and tools that can support you. So your test data platform selection, it's like any other architectural trade-off decision. Here's some things to think about. Probably have a big diversity of data sources. Depending on the ecosystem that you're in, you may not own all of your data. It may be cloud plus on-prem. It may be in many different formats. You may have single APIs. You may have FTP transfers that are coming in. Figure out what your data diversity looks like. Understand the data cloning and how you want to version and make sure that that tool supplies those capabilities for you. Sensitive data masking and encryption. There's some really amazing things that can happen with detecting sensitivity of data, having the tool detect that for you. Data generation, having secure access control. Test data warehouse is something that folks have not yet considered. They continue to think about it in terms of a database, that they replicate a database. But as you're creating myriad data sources, as you're replicating incoming information from integration points, having essentially a warehouse or a lake, whatever you'd like to call it, of your test data is going to be important. And make sure that whatever tools you are electing and selecting have open APIs. You want to be able to integrate and you need to be able to evolve over time. Finally, don't forget self-service features. Now, I've included what my friend and colleague Brian Finster likes to call an eye chart. Not going to read this to you. I'm just going to flash it up for you to see it. And when you download the materials, you can take a closer look at this. But this is the eye chart with quite a lot of details on each one of those high-level items that I just talked to you about. Let's get back to your DevOps or your DevSecOps pipelines. How are we going to integrate TDM with the pipeline? Overcoming data friction supports the quality imperative. Like, there are a number of different things that we need to do to be able to provision at the speed of the need. Versioning the data sets along with the code and the configurations. Reduce unnecessary copies, but make sure that you have self-service. Talked about the integration of the APIs. We also need to think about leveraging virtualization. What I'm talking about there specifically is service virtualization, and API virtualization. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Allow saving of data after tests complete. Allow this to be optional but available. If there is debugging to happen, if there's replication that we talked about earlier, I want to be able to look at the end state of the data and to make a comparison to the start state of the data. Ensure that the cleanup happens in the pipeline. Remember that logs are data too. Now, something that I don't think everybody does is consider adding performance and load testing into the pipeline. I worked with a couple of different teams and we added specifically performance tests into the pipeline. These were measured. We did 2x, 4x, 6x types of testing, but having the ability to spin that up and have that happen as part of the pipeline created a tremendous value to us, and we were able to very early tell that something was going on. So I do want you to consider adding that in and making that a part of your TDM. So over the past few years, I've learned that something that I think is common sense that I normally wouldn't state, well, I probably need to state it out loud. So I've included a slide about this as well. So things that we don't need to automate. Well, I don't need to automate all of the documentation. Don't try to automate a test for anti-automation, things like CAPTCHA. There will be infrequent and low-risk tests. It's okay to make a risk-based decision to not automate. Exploratory or ad hoc testing runs in parallel. There will always be human-in-the-loop testing. Don't make it a part of the pipeline. Make sure that it is separate and distinct and respected. Make sure that they also have availability to that same test data that we've been talking about. Now, there are a number of different players in the test data management platform space. I'm going to show you a few examples. None of these are considered to be a recommendation or an endorsement. These are softwares that I'm currently working with, I'm evaluating, I'm understanding and working with. But I want you to go out and I encourage you to check out these links and talk to these vendors. Understand who is using their platforms and do not be afraid to ask them specifically for their lessons learned. What industry are they in? And is there something that they're specifically focused on? What is their distinct, unique value? Because they're not all the same and they do different things. So looking ahead, we are going to see an emphasis on test environment management. And I want to show you a couple of other things that I think are on the horizon when it comes to testing, test data as part of the DevOps pipeline. We are going to need to understand test environment management. We've talked about test data. We haven't necessarily talked about how we're spinning up different testing environments. What are the purpose? How are we provisioning? How are we cleaning up? What does it mean to have that at parity to production? Digital twin and digital engineering are very important these days, especially to some of my clients, which are part of the US Department of Defense. Digital twin or digital engineering is creating an in-kind environment to where software will be ultimately delivered. A lot of times there's hardware in the mix. It could be a tank, it could be an automated car, it could be a train, but having the ability to have that testing environment, a digital twin of the real environment with the hardware virtualized and having this very specific drivers available gives you the ability to simulate earlier and to react earlier with your testing and having that necessary test data. I also want to see us improve the testing that goes on with API mocking and service virtualization. Service virtualization is not a new tool. It's not a new trick, but it has not gotten the adoption yet. Many people are still doing it themselves. It's not as widespread as I'd like to see it be. Where you use this is when you have especially those external integrations that you don't control. If I'm going to have testing in my pipeline and I want to be able to hit that, those who supply the API may not have a development or a testing version of their API. Work the governance contract with them, have the conversation, and mock up that API so that you can have the positive and negative test cases executing, but doing it with that virtual front end, that virtual mock-up. You're going to see a lot about AI-driven testing, and this will be quite heavy in the next 2 to 3 years. We're already seeing how AI is being driven into testing and test data. And finally, we're going to see a lot more around AI, around models, how I test my models, and the data that I need to test my models is also going to impact test data management and the test data pipeline. So guys, I would love to get more time to chat with you on this. I believe that this probably resonated with you. It's an area where I'm seeing consistent and constant attention not being paid. And I'm also seeing that there's a groundswell of need. So if you'd like to chat some more, you see my contact information. I'd love to connect with you. Thanks for today.